Hello, my name is Matthew Alexander, and I'm a developer on the UrbanCode Deploy middleware configuration team. In this video, I will walk you through some scenarios using the partial apply and partial remove steps of the WasConfigure plugin. Now, usually the WasConfigure plugin manages configurations by a WebSphere scope, with the scope being a WebSphere cell, a node, a server, or a cluster. And this allows us to use the live compare feature to detect configuration drift, to easily compare configuration versions, and to ensure that when configuration data is applied on your system, it totally matches what is in UCD. However, there may be some cases where you want to change pieces of your configuration without managing an entire scope. And for those scenarios, we have the partial apply and partial remove steps, which manage configuration at a WAS object level. Now, for this demo, I'm just going to run through some examples using JAS auth data objects and some SSL config objects. So if I look at my WebSphere environment right now, and I'll see that I have 3 JAS auth data objects on my system, and for the SSL config objects, I have a total of 7. 4 of them are built in to WebSphere, and I'm not going to be interested in managing those. I only want to manage these 3. So the first thing I want to do is create snippets for each one of these objects. Now, I've already run a configuration discovery against my WebSphere cell, which generated a cell.json file which contains configuration for the entire cell. And now I want to split up that configuration file into separate snippet files for each one of these objects. So to do that, I'm going to use a step provided by the WasConfigure plugin called create configuration snippet. And I've just created a simple generic process that runs only this one step. If I look more closely at the properties for this step, I see I have to specify the location of my cell.json file, which I've already done. And next I can choose to input either paths of the resources to extract or just specify an object type. Now for the SSL config objects, you may remember there were some that were built into WebSphere that I don't really care to manage or have snippets for. So I'm going to ignore those, but I'm going to specify the path for the SSL config objects in the config data for the SSL config objects that I do want snippets for. So to do that, I'm going to come into my cell.json file and I'm going to find those paths. I'm just going to search on WebSphere SSL config until I find the objects that I created. You see this one here, the first one we find is the cell default SSL settings object, which is one of the built-in objects. I'm not interested in managing that. So I'm going to search a few more times until I find one with the alias SSL config 1. This is one of the objects I created. So what I want to do is copy the path of that object, and then back in UCD, I'll insert it into this field, which is the paths of resources to extract field. And I'm going to do this again for the other 2 objects that I want to manage as snippets. Okay, so I have the 3 SSL config objects that I want to create snippets for, and I also want to create snippets for the JAS auth data objects. Since I want to manage all the JAS auth data objects in my configuration, I can use this object types to extract field. I'm just going to specify the object type there. Next, I have to specify the name of the snippet file to create, and I want to create more than one snippet file, so I'm just going to leave this ending with a slash, and I'm going to check this create snippet file for each resource option. And when I create this, it's going to create a snippet file for each object with the name format object type underscore and then an integer.json. So I'm going to save that process and then run it. On my system, I extracted my snippets into a folder named apply, so I'm going to go into that folder and see that I have 6 files now, 1 file for each JAS auth data object and 1 for each of the SSL config objects. The next thing I want to do is apply those snippets out to my WebSphere environment, and to make sure they're working correctly, I'm going to go back into WebSphere And I'll just delete a couple of these SSL config objects. I'll delete one of these and I'll change the description for one of these objects. I'll save my changes, and I want to show that I can do an apply and just update only the objects I have snippets for. So I've created a process. I just have my snippets out on my file system. You could have them checked into source control or as component version artifacts, but just for the purpose of this demo, I kept it simple and just put them on my file system. My process I've set up here is also a generic process. You could do this as a component process, but just for the purpose of the demo, I kept it simple and used a generic process. The first step I have here, the delete files and directories. This is just going to be used to clean my working directory, just to make sure no files are present in the directory when the process starts. The next step is this copy directory step. And what this is going to do is going to copy the files from my apply folder and place them in my working directory. Next, we're going to replace tokens, and this just picks up properties like the cell name from the resource tree and replaces those tokens in the configuration data. The next step is going to merge all of those snippet files into one file. We're going to name that file IBM-UCD-resources.json, and this is the file that's going to be applied out. So we have those multiple files. We're going to merge them all, and then we're going to apply them as part of this partial apply step. And you'll see down here in the WebSphere configuration file, we have that file name specified. So now I'll submit that process, and we should see that those objects are created and updated in WebSphere. Okay, the process completed. It took just over 30 seconds. If I go into WebSphere, I should see that I have those 3 JAS auth data objects created. The description was changed back to what's in my configuration data. And if I check out those SSL config objects, I should see that those 3 that I was managing have been created. The built-in SSL config objects are still there and haven't been touched. Next, let's say that I want to remove one of these objects from my configuration using UrbanCode deploy. To show that, I'm going to move some of these files over to another directory that I've named remove, and then we're going to run the partial remove step against files that appear in that directory. So I'm going to move some of these files over to the remove directory so that those objects will be deleted. So I now have these 3 snippet files in my remove directory. So I'm going to delete 2 of the JAS auth data objects and 1 of the SSL config objects. So if I go back to UrbanCode, I've created another generic process, this one to perform a partial remove. It's going to be very similar to the partial apply process that I built. I have the delete files and directories step, which just clears my working directory. I have my copy directory step, which this time it's going to copy the files I have in the remove folder over to my working directory. We're going to replace tokens. We're going to merge all those files into one file. And then finally we're going to run the WebSphere partial remove step. And again, those files are merged into this IBM-UCD-resources.json file. So I will run this process, and we should see that those 3 objects were removed from WebSphere. Okay, it looked like the process completed successfully. I'm going to check the standard out log file to see if some objects were removed. And you can see in the log we have this partial remove entry that shows that 1 of the SSL config objects and 2 of the JAS auth data objects were removed. And to verify that, I'm just going to go back into my WebSphere environment. We'll check out the JAS auth data objects first. We'll see that 2 of them have been removed. And if we look at the SSL config objects, we should see that we have 1 of them missing. I do want to mention that if you do use the partial apply and partial remove steps to change your WAS configuration, then you're not going to be able to use things like our live compare feature, which helps detect configuration drift, as well as using the inventory system in UrbanCode deploy to see what exactly is deployed on your systems. So if you do want to use the partial apply and partial remove steps, a best practice may be to use them to get your configuration in a state that's ready to promote to another environment, and when it's time to promote to another environment, do another WAS configuration discovery, collect your configuration data for your entire WebSphere scope, create a version of it, and then manage your configuration that way. And that would allow you to use the live compare feature to detect configuration drift and to compare versions to see what differences are between versions of your configuration. I hope this was a helpful example showing how to use the partial apply and partial remove steps. For more information, you can check out our documentation for the WAS Configure plugin. There's a section called Partial Configuration Changes that goes into this topic and lists which WebSphere objects are supported by this feature. If there are objects you'd like to see supported by this feature which are not implemented yet, please let us know. Thank you for watching.